tonight we are extremely happy to introduce to you Philipp Esch from ESCH SINTZEL Architecten, which is an office based in Zurich, and an office that has worked for some time. At the moment, actually, the office is also bifurcating into new offices, and of course, Philipp will be part of Studio ESCH Rickenbacker Architecture, and so we wish you all the best for your future endeavor. But tonight, actually, he will present a project, in fact, that really comes from his work as ESCH SINTZEL, and it's really a great project. It's a reuse of a wine storage in Basel. It's a transformation of a storage into housing. Now, I have to say that, of course, adaptive reuse of existing structures, especially for housing, is becoming actually a very important trend in architecture. But I have to say that when with Sophie we were looking really examples of this kind of project, somehow it seems that this project of transformation is often seen as a technical problem, and we're really impressed by this specific project because, as you will see, there is an incredible effort really in transforming this theme into architecture, into really form and space. And I have to say something that I found really, and I mentioned this to you just before, I found really special of your practice, and correct me if I'm wrong, is an incredible attention to the plan. It's almost as if the plan in your projects are almost scripting some sort of idea of how that space should be used. I mean, there is something very structural, very structuralist almost in your projects, especially this project. As you will see, the plan is really beautiful, but also very meaningful in the sense of reinterpreting a building without erasing. It's basically what actually this building used to be. In fact, one of the most landmark moments is this column actually crashing into a room, which I have to say that when I saw it, I mean, of course, it's a very simple design move, but it's something very, very almost iconoclastic. It's almost like a totem in the middle of the space. And this is actually the reason why Sophie and I, we were so eager to have you in this lecture series as the author of one of the most perhaps interesting housing projects developed in the last perhaps years. And so with that, I would like to thank you for being here. And of course, we'll mention this at the end. We will also want to thank everybody that really made this lecture possible. And Sophie will say a few words about it at the end of the lecture. So Philipp, thanks a lot for coming. Thanks all of you for being here. And we are very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Pier Vittorio. So thank you very much for this kind invitation. I feel very honored to be here, and I feel flattered by this interest. The Weinlager is one of our favorite projects, also one of the difficult children that you then love particularly. The interest in this project has been quite overwhelming, and the requests for visits and for presentations have been numerous. And I think evidently this has to do with the topicality of numerous issues that address urgent tasks of our time. It's typical that problems have been recognized, but the possible solutions for them, and indeed build solutions, are very rare. And these topics could include: what form could the post-industrial reorganization of the city take? How do we reuse buildings that were designed for a very different purpose? How could the history of a place remain tangible but not preserved as a monument, but rather reshaped in continuous lively appropriation? For me, My favorite example in this context is always Piazza Navona, a sports infrastructure that is later turning into the most beautiful Baroque square of Rome, that a square that would never have taken the shape had it not had this previous history of a sports stadium. And other questions, how can we create affordable housing in existing structures? This is quite an important issue, I think, because affordable housing usually means either living with the weaknesses of the old building or mostly building new as cheaply as possible. How can density be perceived as a gain in quality of life? Density is a potential when I can share things, when I can benefit from neighborhoods. Another question, how can buildings be turned into power stations? It's an issue that I can't go into detail tonight, but I think the Weinlage is an extremely efficient building technically, energetically. But perhaps it's not just the answers to questions that are typical to our time that explain the great interest in Weinlager. I suspect that the attraction lies in its triggering a lot of associations, of strong associations. And as practicing architects, we need associations when we design. We need associations to speculate on what we don't know yet exactly. We want to talk about goals, about mood expression, about leitmotif. And associations help us when we are still talking, when it's still not very sharp what we are aiming at. And that's especially true when we are entering uncharted territory, when we are doing things for the first time, as is the case here. Architects work very much by association, and Mark Pimlott, whom maybe some of you have heard of, who is himself an architect and a professor emeritus from the Technical University in Delft, he knew this when he wrote the wonderful book, The Public Interior as Idea and Project. In this book, he categorizes public interiors, which are much more difficult to classify than buildings, according to associative categories. And he wrote this for students originally, so it's really a tool, this book. And the categories that he proposes are garden, palace, ruin, shed, machine, and network. Evidently, it's not very evident that public interiors should be labeled with these categories, but they are very open associations that help you defining, your way towards a project that will then eventually become reality. In other words, references are not categorized by type or history, but by association or metaphor. And this is not a scientist's approach, it's admittedly, but it's a designer's one. And what is interesting about this categorization is the unexpected and surprising neighborhoods that it reveals. Now, particularly noteworthy, according to Pimlott, are those buildings that oscillate between several associations. I think his favorite example is the Crystal Palace of Joseph Paxton, which is a palace, a garden, a machine, a network. But or the Centre Pompidou, which he says is a palace and a machine, but also a shed for the art. Such buildings challenge our curiosity in a particular manner, because they cannot be easily categorized, even though our minds are always seeking to do so. And maybe that's exactly what gives them charisma or enigma also. And the Weinlager, although it is not a public interior itself, oscillates between many of the associative categories of Pimlott's, which were frequently used in the discussions we had when we were designing this project. And probably this is why they are still inscribed in the building today. I was reading this book with my students at that time, and it influenced very much the way we discussed. So this is an example of the garden association of this building. This is how it looked like a bit more than a year after completion. Another example for garden. But the Weinlager also has some palatial features, the generosity of this party deck on top of it, or the generous room height it has, that is very unexpected for affordable housing. It has aspects of ruin in it, and as far as these pillars look like remnants of a mythical past that has been newly appropriated by the inhabitants. It has aspects of a machine, either by the facade that tells about its assembly, is colored in this very typical machine color, but also by directly quoting the machine à habiter, Le Corbusier's unité d'habitation. It is also a shed in the way its construction is a bit bricolage, in the way this very graphic and very simple sheet metal cladding is applied. And finally, it's also an example for network, and network not only in as far as the spaces are related to each other at the inside, but also how it interrelates with the outside. So there's a whole wealth of associations that we were not so aware of, but many people we talk to, also residents, keep addressing and talking about them. That's quite interesting, and it's also one of the aspects that are the privilege of when you are reusing buildings. When you're building anew, all these caprices and all these associations of this power wouldn't be feasible. I mean, no client would admit them, I guess. After this detour, let me go into the narrating and explaining the project first. You see here the location as it looked like 6 years ago when we first got to know the place. It's on the outskirts of the city of Basel, at the border with France, and usually at the borders you put the problematic uses of cities, like the chemical factory of Ziba that has then later been converted into Novartis campus, a forbidden city here to the right. We have on the top along the road, we have the border to France. On the left we have a railway cargo station. We have the growing tessuto of the classical tessuto of the city of the early 20th century coming from the south, an urban development around the Voltaplatz. That's about the setting. And our wine warehouse sits and on the border between residential and industrial city, squeezed in between large commercial buildings and sheds. And this is the site last year. The residential city has grown. It has grown up around the Weinlager. Where there were commercial buildings, there is now a square. But large fragments of the forbidden city, of the commercial area, still exist. And if you go look at the future, this is how the Weinlager will be in a few years' time. The residential city will have replaced the industrial city. And where there were sheds, there will be a square. Where there was a square, there will be houses. I mention this because it shows that the Weinlager is a kind of pioneer. And as pioneers carry everything with them, because when they venture out into unknown territory, this Weinlager also has to bring a lot of city within it. Because the city outside the building is undergoing so much change. It's yet to come. This was our first encounter, when we first met this building. A tin-clad container, very few windows, very adverse, forbidding. The surroundings, a desert. How do you make friends with a building like this? And that's important because successful reuse requires a minimum level of friendship. It's not different on the street side. The building is set back, it's windowless, it's behind bars, everything is determined by the internal logic of logistics, nothing by public space. The inner world is quite interesting, it's peculiar, large caverns containing huge tanks, unused, a giant steel superstructure above it. And then the first encounter with these pillars, a very strong form, anthropomorphic, an archaic monumentality where you wouldn't expect it. And this strong shape it triggered something. It was a kind of, it reminded us of Karnak. The Egyptian temples, as you may know, the columns in a Greek temple, they define space, whereas in an Egyptian temple, they displace space. So you find yourself like in a thicket of columns when you walk through an Egyptian temple, and that's how we felt here. The original building was erected in 1955. It's one of the first surprises that we met, that we were actually not planning the second life of this building, but its third life. The building was in its first life also a production center for wine. So they were producing wine. There were large cellars with space for tanks, for barrels. And the house has a certain dignity, somehow appropriate to this function, a certain earnest. And then in 1973, the second life begins. Instead of a wine warehouse, it's now just a disdainful drinks storage container, twice as high as before and twice as deep. A huge steel rucksack is now sitting on top of the existing house and on the side of the building, doubling its depth and height. And the old building is completely overshaped. This is how this looked like at the inside. The steel structure couldn't be kept for various reasons. There was toxic paint on it, and it didn't meet fire regulations and earthquake regulations. But that's how we first met this building. Now, let me just say 2 or 3 words about the client, because at this place the client enters the stage. The Stiftung Habitat is a privately funded foundation. It's almost 30 years old. They own about 500 apartments in Basel and 110 commercial units. And what's very particular to them is that they are not only focusing on affordable housing, but on the amelioration of urban neighborhoods. So they have understood that a residential development can't be thought without the neighborhood it stands in. So with the very wealthy background that this foundation has, they also develop public spaces. They have a particular interest in rehearsal room for musicians. There are some projects in Basel that deal with that clientele. There was a master plan that was done before this competition was started, and it is decided that a new block of residential buildings should be kept free for small cooperatives. That's this ring you see on the bottom left. And 2 streets are cut into the Forbidden City. That's always one of the first things you do when converting industrial sites. First you have to cut and breach cut in openings and make these areas permeable. And these 2 new streets mean that we have to reduce the building. We have to reduce it in depth and in length, and we also have to reduce it in height, because the building regulations require this profile that we don't meet. you see in yellow the whole part of it that has to be removed. But we remove a bit more than we should. We cut also the depth of the building, as you see in the right plan, where the former yellow facade is here. And we do this because the permitted surface that we can use is quite limited. So either we have this very deep building and keep it also at 4 floors or 5 floors, or we add additional floors, but then we have to cut it a bit less deep. So I hope I don't bore you when I talk about the building process, but I think in this project the building process is so much linked to architectural issues, and so many times during this process we have readjusted this project. And I think it's for me one of my key insights from this project. I think the future of building is about designing processes and not products anymore. And I think that's what all of us have to reconsider. Our clients have to reconsider. We have to reconsider as planners, but also the institutions, the cities have to change their mindset in order to follow this new path. In this case, the dismantling is taking place at a super rapid pace. You see these huge excavators. The steel supports that we have labeled, you see these red dots here on top. We have marked which profiles we want to keep for reuse, but these excavators just drip them out and they're all torn, so we can't reuse them. It's also an interesting insight. Next time, just slow down the demolition process. And we rediscovered the dignified old exposed brick building that was hidden underneath the sheet metal shell. Now, should we leave the old columns and cut balconies in between? The engineer boldly advised us no. Just remove the entire strip on both sides of the building. Remove not only the floor slab, but also the pillars, and insert a new load-bearing level. Now, how do you do that? These ceilings are supported first on the inside. You see that on the picture at the left. The windows are nailed shut because the noise that is made by this jetting robot is terrible. And then this jetting robot starts removing the concrete from the steel reinforcements with a very high water pressure. So this is, when at 10 o'clock in the evening you listen to the radio on a square, then your neighbors call the police, but you are allowed to terrorize your neighborhood with a jet robot for 5 months, without legally. I never understood that. Anyway. But after jetting, the facade is sewn into pieces. It has all a very monumental scale, also these big instruments. And in the next bit, then it is bitten into smaller fragments and removed. And the result of it is this. It's a picture that we're a bit ashamed of, because we were shocked when we saw it. We were a bit shocked. At the beginning, we didn't show this picture because we thought, okay, it's about reusing. But in the end, look at how much has remained. Still, it's compared to new building, we have spent 42% less carbon CO2. So it's worth it. But it's an image where you see how fragile this left substance is. It reminds me a bit of a Chinese pagoda. And even before the interventions, the building no longer by far met today's requirements against seismic loads. And of course, in the shape it was very threatened. And the seismic loads in Basel are 10 times higher than in Zurich, so they're very high. And in order to stabilize the building, we installed 2 massive bookends, one could say, to hold the shaky structure in place. And these bookends do not only stabilize the building, but they also extend the building towards the road, so that the building then now is facing the road, as a pair becomes visible in the public realm. And next, the old reinforcements are poured into a new strip of concrete, and the new supports are put in place. You see here the plan. You see in yellow, you see the old reinforcements, and this is what we cast to extend the existing floor slab. And then we put we inserted the wooden pillars, and these pillars are spruce tree trunks, and of course they are associated with the supports that you need in the construction process that you see in the left picture, and that was what originally triggered the idea of having these tree trunks. And we saw, you know, them from building sites, how you stabilize floor slabs with spruce trees, and that's where it started. But of course, it's the image of this. It's not, you know, you can't literally do that. And these tree trunks, they come from the Jura. We had to order them two years before we built them. We built it. That's a difficult thing, because you have to dry them, and if you want to dry them without consuming much energy, you need time. So you cut them, and then you wait for 2 years, and you need a client who follows you in that. I mean, we ordered these trees, and the project was at a very shaky state, in the very beginning of the planning process. We had good arguments, and we had a good client to follow them. And you see the little holes in the middle of these tree trunks. That's maybe quite interesting. That's because the pits in the middle of the wood has a very strong torsional force, so that promotes crack formation. And if you drill it out, the wood will have less cracks. Anyway, it has many cracks, as you can see here. What's interesting, these wooden supports, which have really kept us busy for a year, but these wooden supports, they cost only €100 more than a concrete pillar, €1,000 instead of €900. But of course, their sensuality is incomparably stronger. There isn't hardly a visitor who doesn't hug them sooner or later when you come for a visit. These columns have even more associations. To me personally, they remind me of the columns in the Casa dei Canonici in Sant'Ambrogio in Milano, a Renaissance work by Donato Bramante, who brings natural forms onto these columns in a kind of a cheerful caprice, and thus recalling the origins of the motive of the column. Or take the wooden supports, the wooden pillars in Shinohara's umbrella house that was recently rebuilt in Weil am Rhein on the Vitra campus. It's a support that is at the same time as elegant as a piece of furniture. It's sanded and oiled, and at the same time it's archaic as a remnant from the nature outdoors. And this dichotomy is extremely interesting, and it triggers a lot of curiosity. But of course, they're also reminiscent of the trees in this very early work of La Carton Vassal, this holiday house in Cap Ferret, where you have effectively trees growing through the house. Why did we make these supports of wood? Because we were looking for a kind of the right counterpart to these massive mushroom-shaped pillars in the existing building. we looked for a counterpart that had a comparable physical presence, but at the same time it should be completely of today. So there are no more heavy loads to carry. I mean, in housing, you carry 200 kilo per square meter, and in a storage house, 2 tons per square meter, 10 times the weight. But it should. What we found interesting, we wanted also to convey that these facade supports can make way for new changes once a 4th or 5th life takes place of this house. I think that's a very inspiring thought, to think what could happen. Of course, you have no idea, you can't anticipate the next use, but you can somehow encourage further reuse, later reuse. These pillars are very impressive bodies when we saw them in the large halls of the warehouse. But now, as you mentioned, Pier, Vittorio, but now in the center of the small rooms of a flat, if you take them into a very compartmented structure, they develop a tremendous force. The residential scale makes them even more monumental. And their permanence is emphasized by the dichotomy with the wooden supports. I recently read this quote of Bart Verschaffel that I like very much, because he is telling about the parallel between degré zero in time and the weight and continuity of stone. It reminded me of these pillars. And another reminiscence is in the autobiography of Edgar Reitz, director of the Heimat series, fantastic film series from the early 80s, where he tells about his struggle with the ancient farmhouse that they have chosen for the film scenes, and they have a large beam that is a horrible obstacle. They have to take out a wall, they have to put in a new beam, and this beam is always an obstacle to filming, up to the moment where they transform. He tells about this transformation process, when suddenly he says, hey, I have to turn it into the center of the action. And then in the shade of this beam, everything important happens. People meet, lovers meet, people die, people a bit farewell, and he's comparing it to the legend of Ulysses and Penelope and their tree that they decide to build their house around. So it's really, there's a lot of Jungian collective memory hidden inside it, which maybe could be, hidden inside it. Or yet another example, and then I finish with this, but it's also something that has, I think that has challenged me a lot. It's the apartments of Auguste Perret in Le Havre. I don't know whether you know, Le Havre was destroyed during the Second World War, and Perret had to build it, reconstruct it very quickly. And what he did, what's very peculiar, is that in these apartments, there's always a pillar that is very bulky, but it's done in a very peculiar way. To me, it looks like a spolia. Of course, it's new, but it's done with the care that the rest of the apartment doesn't have. And I think maybe I'm over-interpreting the rough presence of this pillar, but I read in it the desire for permanence, for timeless stability, especially in the surround, behind this background of the destruction in the war. So all these things are hidden within these pillars. Thus, when we were designing this project, we established 2 rules for our project. Like scouts sometimes invent a rule. You don't know yet why you say so. But you say, okay, first rule: always expose these mushroom capitals. Never brick them in. Never let them touch walls. Treat them as pieces of art. So the smallest room is the room the size of a capital. And on the other hand, to make the mushroom supports, make them visible in series, so not to isolate them as solitary elements. So we said on the ground floor we want to show the row lengthwise, and on the upper floor crosswise, always two behind each other. That was a very simple rule and very determining. And this very naive or playful rule proved to be a blessing only later, and that's some of these unforeseen happy coincidences. Because what seemed counterintuitive at the beginning, to place the columns in the center of the room, turns out to be the right thing to do when you look at the reinforcement plans in the archive. If you look at how the iron rods are positioned, you see the yellow zones are where there's a lot of iron, and the white is where there's little to no iron. In buildings from the 50s, there's very little iron in it. So our cutouts in the ceiling, be it for elevators, for shafts, for staircases, they reliably go where there's hardly any reinforcement. So now we see the important intervention. We have dismantled the building in height, in length, and in depth. We have stabilized it at the edges. We have put new stories on top of it, and we have hang a new facade in front. And what's noteworthy, what you see is this huge basement underneath the building that was meant for the tanks. For the wine tanks and the barrels, and we built in a huge two-story garage, and this garage is liberating all the neighborhood from having to build garages. So it's a garage for the whole neighborhood, and it's a very public function that this building in its underground fulfills. I won't bore you now with the distribution of the flats. I think what's important is that you see by the color scheme that we mix small and large apartments. So it's apartments for different lifestyles and ages, and that's a prerogative for lively neighborhoods. And the freedom that the developer gave the participants in the competition, that's also noteworthy. Because he said, hey, the types of flats that you bring depends on what you see feasible within the structure. But what we want is that at maximum a 40 square meter per person should be counted. And that's a 40 square meter of warm surface, so that includes also the whole offer of collective spaces and access, traffic surface. That would correspond to 170 residents, and today we have 183 people living in this house, and 60 of whom are children. So you can imagine how much life. It's really an interaction machine, this building, as it is today. The house as path and place is a title I borrowed from the Austrian architect Josef Frank, who coined this term in the late 1920s. And I think it's very apt in our case. We have a network of corridors and staircases, which seems maybe a bit erratic, but it's effectively the most efficient way to connect to grant access to all the apartments. And it's also interesting because redundancies within this network make it possible that you can access your apartment by different ways, which gives it very much an urban feeling. There are alongside this network, there's a big a wealth of collective spaces, like a cafe, a laundrette, many laundrettes, a co-working space. There's a guest room, 2 guest rooms, a party deck on top with a big collective kitchen. There are rooms for musicians in the basement. That profit from the very high big room height. There's a bicycle workshop, and of course there's this large car park for the entire neighborhood, which relieves the surrounding new buildings from the need to build expensive garages. I take you to a brief tour through the building. You have here the cafe at one of the front sides of the building. You have the rue intérieure at the ground floor with the entrance space. These are photographs when the building wasn't yet inhabited, so it looks very bleak and bare. It's quite different by now. You see here this corridor with the laundrettes behind the glass brick wall. You see how low this ground floor is. Every floor has a different room height. This ground floor was just where the shipping was done, and apparently there wasn't much room height needed for that. We move up to the first floor, and here the room height is very generous. That has to do with the bottling plant that was here originally, very high. This is the smallest room conceivable. This is just the shape of a capital. Then you get into the living room. You see that the grid is 6 meters of these pillars, which means that the living room is only 2.90 meters wide, which is something that no client would accept. But again, it's a privilege of building, of reusing building, that you can. There's so many transgressions permitted. So that's maybe the second insight. The liberty lies in reuse and not in building anew, especially in residential buildings. It's so conventionalized, building new rental houses, rental apartments. But when you have to do with existing structure, you can just say, okay, it was like this, it's 4 meters high and it's 2.90 meters wide. And most clients would want it the other way around, 4 meters wide and 2.90 height. Maybe you note the changing perimeter from plaster to exposed concrete. Where the concrete was very damaged, it was plastered. You see it on top here. And room by room we went through through the building site with our client and created a material trail that is individualizing each flat. It's very pragmatic, but in the end it's very interesting how the flats then change their appearance according to the coincidence of the state of the concrete. Here you see that's the same apartment, once with a pillar like this and once with a beam like this. It's depending on the machinery, these beams differed. And another apartment. Maybe here what's noteworthy is that here this is a mirror. So these are some games we like to work with mirrors, and behind this there's a suspended ceiling because there's the controlled ventilation of this building, and in order to hide this we just added mirrors. Mirrors cost next to nothing, and they produce a lot of effect. We move to the second floor, and there the room height is very low. This beam this is 1.95 meters, so for me it's really at the limit. But you always you live like in the remnants of an earlier civilization. Then we come to the new floors. They are quite different. 3 new residential floors are accessed via 2 corridors. So you have a kind of a unité d'habitation section with one apartment moving downwards and one moving upwards. The middle floor is connected to the flats below and above. And what's maybe also noteworthy is that this is north, this is south, which is also not so ideal if you have such a long volume. But so we said we don't want any apartments that are exposed only to north, with the exception of these small studios. So these studios are not very deep, and they're oriented towards north. And then all this game between the duplex apartment open, they are due to this attempt not to have any north orientation for the living rooms. So we move up. You see here the rue intérieure, and you see then when you move into an apartment, you see we went out of money a bit, but you have a generous staircase spiraling up. You see this kind of kitchen that we use. This kitchen, what we liked is emphasizing the mobile character of a kitchen. The kitchen as they're like tea chests were. I don't know if anybody of you remembers how tea chests were. Wonderful things with aluminium at the inside. And this is the top floor of it. We added this window to give some light and allow relations between the room above and the two-story high kitchen. Then we move up yet another floor, and here you see this the private balconies that run parallel to the corridor that goes here. And here we have very small apartments. Some of these apartments, like this one, has then a stair going down. I don't know to which apartment it belongs. Maybe to this one, I think. Yes, exactly. So this is an apartment that has 2 bedrooms underneath and 1 above. So it's what Aldo van Eyck, the Dutch theorist, called labyrinthian clarity. I think that's a wonderful concept. So for insider, for the inhabitants, they all know exactly perfectly where they are. But as a visitor, you feel a bit at a loss, like in a souk or like in a kasbah. And that's the party deck on top. These are the ventilation shafts from the toilets. So we just had to do something with them. We put some tables around them. They're not supports. This story was not planned at all originally. We only discovered later, hey, within this profile we could have another floor, but we were run out of exploitable surface. We had no surface so we just had to invent some uses. We said, hey, let's have some laundrettes and a kitchen. That was granted to us, and we have this additional floor. So some potentials, and another example for potentials recognized in the process. And yet another one, this big cavern was to be demolished. The client didn't want it. You see it in section. And we wanted to fill it up with second life batteries from old car batteries, and then use it for the charging, for storing the electricity from the photovoltaic panels. And the client didn't feel at ease with a cavern full of car batteries, and so. But now they are rehearsal rooms for musicians there. 2 or 3 points about the process, the scars in such a building. There were 650 of these holes that were due to the hydraulic system of the bottling plant. They were very difficult because many of them had metal tubes in it. They were difficult to fill up. We couldn't get rid of the plaster. It's something that in the design process in the beginning you say, hey, we expose all the concrete and it will look wonderful, and then you find out it doesn't work. So as a result, we have apartments that are very much plastered over, and we have other apartments that look a bit ruinous. And it's interesting. You need a client who permits you to do that, and it's interesting how the same apartment can develop completely different features and qualities. Another observation from the process: these pieces that have a potential for spolia. As I said, demolition processes are so fast that you really have to stand next to the machines and say, stop, hey, put this here, maybe we can use this one day. And these were fantastic pieces, only we had no idea at that time, and a week later they were gone. Or other things, a bit bricolage. These are doors that were a bit difficult to solve with these beams that were that hung so low at 190 or 95, so we had to invent kind of very custom or bricolage solutions for them. But of course, I think it adds to the character. It's, in the end, they work as doors. Are these kind of strange corners that it's not that we designed a lot about them. We just had to solve them somehow, and we were very happy of this of these unexpected results. There's one short. I will keep this short. I think it's Heinrich Tessener, who for me is one of my. I think one of my most inspiring teachers, and it's a fantastic author. He lived at the from 19. He practiced from the end of 19th century till about 1950, for a very long span, and he was very influential at the beginning of the century. And he was very much into housing. He was a specialist in housing, and he says. I just read this last part of it. A home is all the more homely, the more diverse or contrasting things that make up the home are, and the more peacefully these things stand side by side. So it's two things. It's the diversity and these things standing peacefully side by side. So it's not just having a diversity of things spread out. You have to bring them into a certain harmony. But don't look for fusion. Cherish the autonomy of the elements. It's Marcel Meili used to call it the Elemente bei sich lassen. I think that was quite a. This is again the kitchen. It's a quote of Josef Frank's the handles of furniture of Josef Frank for the Viennese municipal buildings. About the facade, I will talk little. You see that this building here was added late in the meantime, but nevertheless, our building is now very much more addressing of the public realm of the Elsässer Straße, whereas this one was very adverse. The color I briefly mentioned. The color we chose is this color RAL 6011. It's in German Reseda green, and it's the color that I think all over Europe, maybe even worldwide, is used to paint tools and machinery. Always the same green. I don't know for what reason, but it's a color that immediately evokes industrial context. This is the front facade of the house with the cafe on the bottom, as we talked about. I talked about it already. Maybe one little thing to mention is these red tins here. These are the nests for birds, for the Mauersegler. It's a protected bird species that you have to find places for them, and they have to fall down, to fly. You have to give them like 3 meters or 5 meters of empty space underneath. So it was a nice collateral gain. The facade is is simply constructed in a very simple way. What turned out to be important slowly was that it was a bit about anticipating a fourth life. This design to disassembly issue is interesting because it leaves open what will happen in a fourth life, but it's in a way it's just facilitating future reuse. If you make a kind of bilan, concerning the construction energy, this building used 42% less than a comparable build a new. It wasn't cheaper than building a new, but it wasn't more expensive. It took more time. It took about 4 months more than a new building would have taken. So this is something you have to convince the client of. And these 42% are not monetarized, so it's just goodwill you do them. And I hope that soon it will be penalized or it will be incentivized if you build like this. And last word about this, about the thermal, the energy household of this building. This is the building has 800 square meters of photovoltaic panels. It has a groundwater heat pump with free cooling, meaning that in summer you can cool this building down 4 degrees. It's without any air condition. You just have the pump, the water pump running in summer. And the self-sufficiency is by it's 2/3 of the house. So it's interesting how you can, even with a very old structure that was definitely not conceived as particularly energy efficient, that what you can get out of it. There were a lot of people involved in this project. We were general planners, so we had all the other planners under us, except for ProPlanning, the building management company. I just want to mention them because they did a fantastic job. We are working with them on several projects since. I mentioned the foundation, the program. It's 64 apartments and ateliers. A cafe, all this I mentioned already. So I've come to an end. Last week we had the book launch of our book. I think there's one copy here. Feel free to take a glimpse. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, it was great. It was really an amazing lecture, and this project is so rich of details, and as you said, it's really a process. Actually, although I spent some time really looking at the drawings and the photographs, I've not had a chance to visit yet, but I really would like to see the richness really of solutions, of design moves is amazing. Although actually the plan also has a certain simplicity. You said that it's very labyrinthic, but this idea of using the bay in this very strange way, having the column and the capital, in fact, dictating the module. It's incredibly powerful. Of course, when you were lecturing, I really couldn't stop thinking of the famous definition of Victor Shklovsky of what art is about, which is, for him, is making things unfamiliar. And it seems like every detail, every element, in a way. Also this idea of designing by almost detaching elements, creating their own autonomy. In a way, it seems like making everything almost unfamiliar. Even like the most banal element, a handrail or a column or a piece of furniture, becomes almost an object in itself. So my question is, how residents react to that? Also this totem in the middle of the room is almost like having a person, inside your space.
That's a very good point, Pier Vittorio. Because I think you're never alone in this apartment. There's always somebody living there with you. Maybe sometimes you'd like to send him out, but he's still there. But I think it's in a way, it's as in this quote of Edgar Reitz, sometimes it's Salman Rushdie once described, arranged marriage. You have your parents arrange a marriage for you, and then in the beginning you may be not so much in love with this person, but then you for lack of alternatives you start liking this person even for its for her or his peculiarities. And I think that's the case here. So maybe 20 years later you really miss this column when you move out of this house. I hope it is so.
Any question from you?
Not formulated yet. I have the feeling that the process was an archaeology, a constant archaeology. First of the existing building, then when it was demolished, I suppose you found new things and you needed to do a cartography of this. And then I'm curious, in the last stage, when you were deciding, okay, this is really awful, we need to put plaster, this we leave as it is. This is monstrous. How did you transmit this to constructors? Like you were putting X on the walls and...
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's how we did it. But, you know, I'm teaching at Mendrisio and I have a studio on Riuso. And I think what we learned in the 4 years that I'm teaching there is that it's like turning around and zooming upwards. It's not the classical process of going from large scale to small scale, but you start looking at the door handle, and then you slowly move outside. And you move like, it feels a bit like a scout, you know, in a forest. And my predecessor, Martin Bösch, he used to call it caso per caso. Look case per case. And of course, this could also end in chaos or in just, you know, so you need a strong narrative, and that's why these associations are so cool, because they are open enough to, you know, that they can synthesize many aspects, but they are also clear enough that some things are excluded, or that you know, they help you take decisions. But of course, in the very concrete case of, do we put plaster here, or do we, you know, can we leave this? Is this okay? For example, this part of this pillar here is cast anew. It wasn't there. It was just three-fourths of this pillar. But the client said, "Hey, it's not possible. Please put this." You know, because even this pillar, 4 meters 20 high, for many people it's a bit precarious, and when you see how these fissures open on the trunk, then maybe some of them don't feel so safe. So this was the kind of negotiating with the client, but in a very good way. I think it's interesting. It wasn't a client who was, you know, trying to conventionalize the house. So this is a pillar that costs €1,900, and you could have a fair tree trunk for €1,000, €100 more.
Lecture. It was a pleasure also. Thank you for your generosity, because we were in a very long story where we met architects that you like, elements that you met, and a lot of levels of reality that are linked all together around this project. So this is something that is really great. I would just would like to highlight one point that you explained, that is the 2 rules that you decide. And I know that when you decide this, it's a great moment, because you find the key, in fact, to begin the project, and you pass in another phase of the project. The first one is incredible, the fact that you choose this element, and the walls can't touch it, and so it's the center of the space. And the second one is I really like the second one also, because when you are in apartments, in little dwellings, you are always in little spaces. Mm-hmm. But if you always have 2 elements, you feel a part of a big network that is a sort of common structure that goes through all the people who live there. So you feel you feel with all together. Because here, if you got this pole, I think that you don't feel with all the community of the poles. But here, the poles are so incredible that you feel in a common structure. So how can you just take one moment to explain those 2 points? Because they are, it's not 3 or 5, 4 or 5 points, just 2, and it's really relevant.
I think you're addressing a very interesting and important point. I think it's difficult to put that into words, but I think it's important that you feel that you're in a structure that is larger than your apartment. So somehow, if you have a kind of continuity that is surfacing within your apartment, something that goes through, and these, of course, these pillars, they signal very much so that you're inside a much larger structure, and it's just by coincidence that these walls are now standing there, and then they will go and make place for a new compartments in the future. And what I find difficult, what I find so interesting is, can you make the house present in your apartment? I don't know if I know if that makes sense. Sometimes you have apartments where there's a presence of the house within it. For example, in this very fragile wood construction in Basel, in this courtyard project that we did, you have this this continuous wood structure that runs through, and then you just have some separating walls. Of course, constructively, it's super complicated to create that impression that you are living in a large shack, and that you feel that the shack is much larger than your apartment. So, how can you somehow transfer some of the large scale into the domestic scale of your apartment? And I think in this case it was relatively simple because of the sheer monumentality of the page.
Merci à toute l'équipe pour ce soutien. Je propose de partager un apéro. Merci encore.